Welcome, everybody, to the Speaking Up with Patrick Schilling podcast, the podcast that aims at expanding your horizon. You already guessed it. My name is Patrick, and I just love having great conversation with amazing people. So, bear with me as I present to you amazing speakers whose ideas may truly change your life. All right, everybody. Today we're talking to Theo Wanner. Theo and I just met recently and immediately got along because we seem to have quite similar interests. One of the field of our interest is surrounding conversation, or in particular, nonverbal conversation. It so happens that over the course of his study, Theo wrote a thesis, more precisely two theses, about the topics surrounding personality traits and also body language and how the two of them interrelate. So we sat down in a admittedly very loud and crowded space and recorded an episode about that. Audio quality is not the best. I'll definitely work on that. So you might have to adjust and readjust the audio a little bit every now and then. My apologies for that. That's definitely going to be better in the next episodes that I'm going to release. However, the conversations was amazing. Theo had a lot of great pieces of advice for how to, become more self-confident, or how to navigate conversations with different types of people better, and to how to also achieve your goals in a conversation a bit better. So without further delay, I present to you Theo Wanner. Hey, and welcome everybody to today's episode. I'm here today with my friend and work colleague Theo. Theo, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. Thanks for inviting me.
No, thanks so much for coming. I know you have a pretty busy schedule these days. You just started your job at Google as well, right?
Exactly. It was about 4 months ago when I moved to Dublin and started working for Google.
Nice. So you started about 2 months before me. For those of you listening, we should maybe say that since we started together, we've become pretty good friends so far. So we'll just see where this conversation leads us. So Theo, tell us a bit about yourself. What have you done so far? What's your story? What makes you wake up in the morning?
So I grew up in Switzerland, and where I basically did all my school stuff, high school, and then did a bachelor's in business administration. Mm-hmm. Afterwards, I decided to go a little bit abroad because I just wanted to explore the world a little bit and see, how other cultures work. So I decided to go to the Netherlands in Groningen to do a master's in finance.
Nice.
Which I pursued then for about half a year, and then I did some other projects in between and traveled around, went to Indonesia and did some research there. Afterwards, cool. I came back to Groningen and started a second master's in entrepreneurship.
Oh, so you did you went on with your master's in finance and then decided that one master's would not be enough for you?
Indeed, yeah. That's actually it, yeah.
Cool.
So basically what appeared to me a little bit strange was that the finance perspective was really one-sided, and I wanted to get a broader picture of how companies really work and how basically you can have a different perspective on a company and on the success of a company. So that made me basically do the second master's. Yeah,
and entrepreneurship, I guess, helps you a lot with that, like getting perspective about how things work in companies or in the world, really. So that must have been quite a nice experience right there.
Yeah, indeed. And both the disciplines basically look at companies and look at how promising, for example, a company is, and they do it from completely different perspectives. And they're kind of not really controversial, but they kind of add up really nicely. So both of the perspectives are really important.
They do, yeah. They kind of round your profile off a little
Absolutely.
bit, so that's pretty nice. So tell me a bit more about Indonesia. What did you do over there?
So I basically started a consulting project from the university itself.
Cool. Did you start it yourself?
I didn't start it myself,
okay.
But I was basically able to join that.
Awesome.
It's a project that basically comes every year, and participants from the University of Groningen, they can participate and do research for a Dutch or a multinational company that might consider expanding to Indonesia, or that have a business partner in Indonesia, and they just need some advice or some insights about the Indonesian market.
Cool. So you kind of went there and you researched a market expansion strategy for a particular company?
Yes, indeed. Yeah. It was, in that particular situation, it was for Kraft-Heinz, the
nice
multinational.
Okay.
And they were doing some business in Indonesia connected to what they bought and how they sold, which is what basically we're doing some research in that area. So, and it was split up basically in some research we did back from Holland, in which we basically just tried to analyze the situation, how it really is, and then we went to Indonesia to get a better impression of how things actually work in Indonesia.
And did the research theory that you did in the Netherlands, did that kind of go in line with what you actually found in Indonesia, or how was the experience of actually being there?
Well, it's always different. Once you have the things you do in theory, they might help you, give you a certain framework, a certain way of thinking and analyzing problems, real world problems.
Right.
But when you actually go there and try to analyze something or try to get to certain information and then try to crack that, get to the key results, then it always turns out to be a little bit different than the theory itself. But it definitely helps.
Right. I could imagine. Well, nice. I hope I'll get to go to Indonesia one day myself.
So too.
But so this is actually a pretty nice opener for the topic we kind of figured we would talk about, like how far theory differs from the actual manifestation of things. When you came back from Indonesia and went back to the Netherlands, you wrote your master thesis, right, about a pretty cool topic that I'm sure will be of interest to a lot of the people listening. So just introduce us a little bit to what your thesis was about.
So I obviously did two theses, and the one in finance I did about financial knowledge, basically, of individuals and how it connects and how it interacts, basically, with personality traits, and how what the impact is of those two on the saving behavior. And the thesis for business I did about body language and entrepreneurs when they pitch their final ideas to business angels. Okay,
and the two of them, pretty amazing topics. And did you choose them with a specific intention in mind? Like, personality traits and body language kind of sounds like something that might go along a little bit, or how did that work out for you?
Well, I've always been really interested in the topic of psychology and any kind of psychology, especially communication. And personality traits is certainly something that's really important in that area, and body language as well. And I initially wanted to take a topic that basically covers both a little bit and that would go hand in hand. So I don't, that I wouldn't have two completely separate topics, but then actually so that I can, expand my knowledge as far as I can in the area of psychology and communication.
Right, and talk us a bit through the personality trait theory that you had. Like, I know there are a lot of different models, like the Big Five is like the classical model. Are there any, interesting theories you stumbled across during your research?
Well, there are plenty of interesting theories, but mostly they all come back to the Big Five.
Okay.
The Big Five is basically the one that is on the level of detail that is the lowest one. While you have, for example, in other theories, you have many different personality traits. In the Big Five, you have 5 different personality traits, and they try to cover, and they actually do pretty well, so they try to cover all the different areas of a personality. And it's pretty amazing theory, generally, because it tells a lot about how people are, how people think, but also how people communicate and how people perceive other people, which makes it all really interesting.
So at the bottom of it, enlighten us a bit there. The Big Five, explain the theory about that a bit more for those of the listeners who might not be that familiar with it.
Well, it basically splits up the personalities into 5 different areas. There is conscientiousness, which is basically the personality trait which looks at how your focus on detail is, how you want to plan things, how your behavior is when you plan things, how much structure you need in daily life. There's extroversion, which is a personality trait about how extroverted basically you are and how outgoing, how comfortable you feel in large groups. There is openness to experience, which is also called in an intelligence personality trait, which is about how you imagine the future, how you think about the future, how you basically are open to new experiences, and how positive that is. There is agreeableness, which is a very social trait, which is basically about how much do you need social agreeableness in for example, a team, but also how much empathy do you have, and how are your intentions with that empathy. And there's neuroticism, which is kind of like the only trait that is defined in a negative way, which is the emotional stability, or let's say like higher neuroticism means lower emotional stability.
And when you and I mean the theory of that, I would then imagine that you take a specific person and try to kind of measure them on those 5 scales that you just outlined.
Indeed, yeah, absolutely. You ask a set of questions. People try to answer those questions as good as possible and as honestly as possible. And after all, you get a score on how high you score in each personality trait.
And that, and from your experience, is that something that is, of scientific value, obviously, insofar as it allows for a framework to kind of, help approach personalities in that way? But is that also something that you would see, in your day-to-day life? Let's say in your experience, if you meet someone new, would you be, all right, well, on the agreeableness, that person is kind of a 5 out of 10? Or how does that work for you?
Yeah, I mean, you definitely can detect it in some people. Especially, generally, the higher you score in something, the more you could basically see that person is really scoring high at something, or has really a characteristic personality. And it's really funny because in my personal experience, it's also that once you're scoring really high on a certain personality trait, you also tend to see those people more that score on this personality trait high as well. But you also tend to overestimate them, their capabilities. You tend to get along better with those people because you agree on more things. So detecting it, yeah, you can definitely detect it, especially if you get to know a person better. But it's also, in my experience, often a little bit biased, because you tend to see the people that are very similar to you more often or quicker than the others.
And I mean, that makes sense, I guess, from a common sense perspective. We all like to be around people that are agreeable to the extent that we could talk to them about certain things and they would not immediately tell us, oh no, I think you're entirely wrong, right? But in a group setting, I know you also looked a lot into group settings, or let's say in a work-related environment where there's another purpose to a social gathering than just, being social, but there's usually a goal or an outcome-driven idea of the gathering itself. Is that actually something that would be beneficial for the purpose of the group, having a lot of people that have similar scores, or is that usually something that would be a bit more inhibitory to the actual group's goal?
Well, I think generally from an academic perspective, there is some research, but it's really difficult to assess it, especially because there's no data about that. So very often you have the situation that you can actually access personality scores, but you don't have data about how the team was and what the group outcome or the team outcome was. The studies that do exist, they definitely show that it has a really big impact. So what you want in a team, in a really good team, a team that is better than once you just mix them together randomly, is you want all the 4 personality traits. When I say all the 4, I mean conscientiousness, extroversion, openness to experience, and agreeableness, while neuroticism is like the negative one, which kind of has the potential to destroy the others. Not destroy, but to basically lower the impact of the others.
Right.
So what you want to have in a perfect team is you want to have all the 4 represented. And you want to have all the 4 not only separately, but also people who can actually bridge. So people who are good in, or score high in 2 or 3 different personality traits. And it's really important because if you, for example, have extroverts, go-getters, they tend to, in their behavior, for example, in a team, which is, let's say, a startup, for example, and you want to excel, then those people, they tend to do things really quickly. They want to get things done as fast as possible. While people who score high in openness to experience, they are more the guys who want to rethink the vision, the goal, and they want to they imagine, they come up with crazy ideas about where they want to go, where they want to be in 10 years, whatsoever. The conscientious people, they're the ones that say, okay, we need clear structure, we need a certain budget, we need a certain idea, we need deadlines, we need to achieve those, get those deadlines, and so on. The agreeable people, they're mostly the ones that say, well, harmony in a team is really, really important. And in fact, while each personality trait tends to underestimate the impact of the others, but all the four are really important. It is really important that you have those people who can kind of bring those people together and can say, okay, well, on the one hand, we need to act and we need to do things like the extroverts want, but we need to have a goal and a common vision. We need to know where we're going and not just do now and then realize that in 2 months that we actually did something that doesn't really add value. We also want to have the people who set deadlines, the conscientiousness trait. And you want to have agreeableness in the team. So you want to have team members that basically support each other and don't play against each other, don't want to get all the lorries for themselves.
that doesn't sound like something that would ever happen in any
never
in no group setting whatsoever. But I mean, okay, so basically what you're saying is you need people with certain traits that are complementary to the traits of the other people, and then you also need people who kind of bridge the strengths of the individual traits and also kind of remedy the weaknesses of the individual traits, right? Am I understanding you correctly?
That's absolutely correct.
So that sounds to me like a perfect team would consist of 4, maybe 5 people in general. Now, you mentioned startups in the startup realm, and this is also something you researched about in your other master's thesis, which, by the way, is crazy that you wrote 2 theses. I just recently wrote my bachelor's thesis, and I already didn't get to finish that, so kudos there for you. But most startups usually have, 2 founders, maybe just have 1 founder. So is it like, would you say that one individual could have, sufficient strengths throughout various of those characteristic traits to be successful by themselves, or is it usually advisable for a group to kind of start a project where all those characteristic traits you have are already there, or how high can like one individual score throughout various of those traits?
Well, to answer your last question, one person can score high in multiple traits. Most commonly, I think people score high in 1, maybe 2. The ones that score high in 3 or 4 is rather rare. So, but it doesn't really matter that much, because if you're an individual who scores high in one particular area, you just want to make sure that you actually get access to the other. So you just want to be aware that you lack certain traits, that you lack certain mindsets. And if you're not willing, or if you don't want to found a company or build a team with those people, then make sure that you have some kind of mentor that basically guides you through this. So basically you can outsource those traits. So you can basically, if you're really aware about it, that you're a completely messy person who doesn't have deadlines and is not able to stick to budgets whatsoever, then make sure that you have someone that helps you there.
Okay. And that process, I mean, becoming self-aware, or the process of self-assessment, is not something that is a whole lot of fun. Like, you wouldn't sit down on a Friday evening and be like, oh, let's assess all my weaknesses that I have in my personality today. So what are some of the tips that you could give for becoming actually aware of one's own weaknesses? So
I really think, as far as I know, that really sitting down and thinking about it and reflecting is a really good way, because you want to see, for example, in past projects, why did it, if it failed, of course, why did it fail? What was not good enough? And then you want to improve based on that. And personality assessments are, I think it's a really good way to reflect, because it shows you things that you would not think of otherwise. So what happened to me, for example, was that I didn't really realize, what happened actually to all of us, is that we didn't really realize that we're lacking certain behavior because we don't value it. We don't think it is important. So basically, if you're, let's say, a go-getter, the extrovert type, and then you think that actually acting is really important that's what makes a great team. I had a great session once during my master's about personality traits, and in the very beginning, she said, our lecturer said, well, now think of what makes an excellent team. And we would sit in different corners based on our personalities, and we would argue with each other why we think that whatever we thought of makes an excellent team. And the thing is that you don't really realize how important the other things are because it's in your personality. That's what you have been good at. That's what that brought you success, or the successes you had so far. So you kind of tend to underestimate the capabilities. And personality assessment is a good way of showing you this. While only self-reflection, basically, there you run the chance that you think back and you don't really see what you did wrong.
So are there some sort of tools or like tests that would help you to actually assess your personality? And if so, which one would be the one that you would recommend anyone who might be listening to this?
Well, for anyone who doesn't really have budget, I would just suggest to
which is going to be most of us. I would imagine
most of us, I guess. Yeah, I would just suggest to go online and Google Big Five theory or Big Five assessment test, and you'll find plenty of free versions, so you can fill it in. Don't always take it for granted because the real professional ones, they have loads of questions, are really detailed. So there are quality differences, but I would just recommend to go online and start looking for, especially for the Big Five personality test.
Big Five. All right, so we'll make a mental note for that. So I found the corner example to be quite cool because I would imagine that if you group up with people that are kind of similar to your own personality, you would have, similar paths almost that led you to the situation that you were in right now. So is it, in how far does your personality or the traits that are inherent to your personality determine the way you take in life? Like, would you say that someone who is, scores very high on the extroversion scale is significantly more likely to become an actor, for instance, than someone who, scores low on that scale? Like, is there some sort of correlation between, between that and the profession that you choose or the hobbies that you engage in?
I definitely think so. Yeah. I definitely think that it leads you a certain path. So let's say, for example, salespeople tend to be more extroverted. They tend to like to talk to people. They tend to be very persuasive, so they're more likely to be really good at their job. So I think certain jobs, for example, if you're more into, let's say, computers, if you're more into computer science, if you're more into programming, it's not a very social job, or it does not need to be a very social job. So people who don't need very much social interaction tend to go there. Doesn't mean that this is always the case. Obviously, there are extroverts who become programmers, and there are introverts who become salespeople. But I think there's a tendency of people to choose whatever you're bent to be.
Okay, and do you see, or is there any statistical difference between cultures or even genders? Let's say, like, are people from the traditional West, like, do they score higher on a specific scale than from Asia, for instance?
No, not that I know of. No, people all over the world tend to be rather similar. It's pretty similar to basically IQs, which also there's no statistical difference between IQs of different countries, for example, or cultures. So the same counts for personalities. It's really a topic that is very inherent. So we basically are we basically grow into something. So this partially it's genetics, but also partially it's, of course, how you grow up. But all over overall the cultures, it tends to be really similar.
Okay, that's good to know. And when you say it's partially genetics and partially the way how you grow up, I would imagine it's not like your personality. Obviously, as you grow older, most of the traits will be more set in stone than when you're young and you're still kind of, your environment is ever changing, and also the neurological structure that you have in your brain is ever evolving, which, flattens out a bit as you grow older. But let's say you're in your mid-20s, as the two of us are, and there are certain aspects about my personality, for instance, that I like more than others, right? Like I have some traits about myself that I've identified to very much dislike. Like, what can a person do to kind of eradicate, the traits about themselves that they don't like?
Well, it's a hard question because another question tightly related to this is, should you? Does it even make sense? Does it make sense to try to get better in the things you're not good at? Or is it smarter maybe to focus on the things where you're just good at and try to excel there? And it really depends, I think, on the situation. And what basically has been told us in school is always that if you're not good in let's say a subject, it's not always comparable, but let's say if we compare that now, let's say you're not good in the subject, you got to put more effort into that subject. If you're very good in one, just, you can kind of ignore it because you're good anyways. And this approach, I think, is not really, this might be good for basic knowledge, but it's not really what we want to do with the personalities. And I think it makes a lot of sense to say, like, okay, I'm at there and there I'm really good at. And by the way, to what you said before, they tend to fluctuate a little bit until, like you said, the mid-20s or beginning of 20s. And then they start to stabilize. They become really stable, and only basically agreeableness is the only trait that tends to increase over time. But you would really want to see, when you do an assessment, for example, in your mid-20s, and you realize that you're really good in a certain area and certain personality trait, you want to rather think about how can you excel there? How can you use this personality trait to get better at something, or to get ahead, or what do you want to do? Because after all, it's your personality. It's not, you don't really want to change your personality, but you want to see and use your personality to get to your goal.
So that sounds pretty much like a smart thing to do, right? In the world where we go through these year-long educational systems that essentially whose only goal it is to kind of invest as much into us as possible for us to be able at one point to give something back, to create something that society will benefit from. And as soon as that level of like common knowledge, as you mentioned, is kind of there, then it makes sense to become a specialist in certain aspects of your life. But does that, I mean, the entire topic around, the filter bubbles is something that is pretty much, relevant these days, or more relevant than ever. Let's say you self-optimize yourself into whatever you're good at, talking to people, for instance. Does that in turn make you, move into those areas more, where you would then again, spend more time with people that also like talking to people that have similar ideas to you, that have, a comparable mindset? And does that then, not kind of shelter you from people in the other corner, to come back to your example from the lecture from earlier?
Yes, yeah, that's kind of right. The core thing, basically, what I want to say is that you don't need to become good at something. You don't need to. It's enough if you basically access that. If you, for example, you have a team and you're just not the guy who talks to people, you're just not the guy who presents the presentation or the final pitch whatsoever, then you can look for a guy who does,
right, and
who's really good at it. Obviously, you can argue that if you're not an extrovert and you just need some, let's say, networking for to reach your goals, then obviously it makes sense to kind of train it a little bit, and to try to get out of your comfort zone and try to talk to people you don't feel comfortable with, or you don't feel comfortable in those situations. So it makes sense to kind of make it up to a certain degree. Also, if you're not structured, it makes sense to actually try to become a little bit more structured. It can make sense, but the core thing is that as long as you can basically access those people, and as long as you can communicate with those people, it, for many things in life, it's going to be enough.
Yeah. I guess that's a more than fair point. And at one point, the question also arises, especially when talking about personality traits and specialization in them. To what extent would you actually have the intent to self-optimize, if I may use that expression here, your personality? Or do you just say, I'm not super great at, talking to strangers. And that's totally fine. I don't have to be. I can accept who I am, and I can live with who I am, and I can kind of, become happy with that. So how do you see that kind of, you know, continuum of options, like self-optimization versus at one point just accepting who you are and making the best out of it?
Well, I think it really depends on the situation. So there might be situations in your life where you just realize, well, I'm not getting where I want to go or where I want to be without, bridging this weakness and without improving there. So in those situations, when you realize, for example, like I said before, you need to go to a networking event, you need to network more. Otherwise, you don't know the right people. You don't, you want to get in touch with certain companies. Then it certainly, and you don't have access to those people, then it certainly makes sense to kind of improve. And also, if you're really, really uncomfortable with something or really score low on something, for example, you're completely chaotic, it makes sense to kind of get there a little bit and just try to, set up a framework in which you want to work and to just stick to rules and just try to improve there a little bit. So I think it really depends. But generally, so if you're not getting where you want to go because of the personalities, improve. But to do your core job should be what you can do really well. So if you really enjoy talking to people, consider sales. If you're really structured, consider a job where a structured approach is required, because that's what you like to do, that's what you're good at, and that's what you just intuitively want and like, and there you can excel, compared to the others, the other trades. So I would say for the core job, excel on what you're good at anyways. For whatever needs to be done within that core job or core role you want to take in, try to improve.
Okay, that sounds like a good piece of advice right there. And I want to shift the conversation a bit more to your second master thesis, which you wrote about body language and how, in how body language kind of affects an entrepreneur's ability to receive funding. So to elaborate on that a little bit, like what was the thesis about?
So the thesis was about the pitches of entrepreneurs and teams of entrepreneurs for business angels, basically. They all try to get some funding for the companies. So what I try to analyze is basically all over nonverbal behavior. So I analyzed the body language, which is one part of it. I analyzed the voice, how deep is the voice, how high is the voice, how animated do you speak, and I analyzed basically how do you speak in terms of what kind of words do you use, are they more complex, less complex, how fast do you speak, how slow do you speak, and those factors. And I tried to find out basically, are there any key drivers or are there any influencing factors that might even improve your ability to get funding.
And what were the findings there? So did you could you figure out a key pattern that you would say, well, if someone speaks with a very deep voice, in a very animated way, and pretty slowly, they're more likely to receive funding, or how did that play out?
Yeah. I looked at the three categories I just mentioned, and I looked at the interaction of those three categories. So not within the categories, but only across the categories. And I really found that actually it does have an impact, a significant impact. Mm-hmm. So there are traits, or there are basically ways to communicate in which you increase the chance of getting funding. And the main finding was basically that I used the construct of dominance. So basically, how dominant do you appear? How dominant is your body language? And the more dominant it is, the higher basically the chance to get investment. And dominance is, for example, if you have lower voices. Lower voices stand for basically higher dominance. Higher voices less dominant. Low variation, basically not animated speaking, is also a sign of dominance. So basically, people who speak very low and in a very not animated way, they kind of tend to appear more dominant, and dominant is meant here now really in a really positive way. So people who would listen to someone and that person would appear dominant, people would overestimate intelligence, overestimate capabilities of that person.
So what I'm hearing here is whenever you want to receive funding or just want to achieve your goal, just sit back, lower your voice, and talk very slowly.
Talking fast. Well, basically, it is. You want to have a low voice, not much variation.
Mm-hmm.
You want to speak rather fast. Use simple words, and you want to expand your body as much as you can. You want to appear as large as you can. You want to use your hands for gestures, and those are really the findings that I had. If you use all of this together, not all of them necessarily, but if you use multiple of the dominant traits together, then the chance of receiving funding is higher. So to go through all the variables I measured is basically in the body, how wide are your legs, how wide is your body generally, how dominant and how self-assured are you standing there when you present your company. How do you use your hands? Do you use it for gestures, or do you just keep them still, or even hide them behind the body, or hide them in your pockets whatsoever, which is really negative. So you really want to show your hands. It's a very important thing for a first impression. Show yourself, show your hands, show that you don't have a gun behind your back and don't try to shoot them,
Hey, some of the listeners might be in the U.S., so that might have an entire different relevance over there. But yeah, so all right, we'll just go with that for the moment.
So yeah, so you want to show your hand. You want to be as large as possible. You want to make yourself as large as possible. Then also, like I said, the voice, low voice, steady, and speaking in simple words. So don't use. I measured it basically in how many syllables has the average word.
Mm-hmm.
So use less syllables, use less complicated words, and this increases basically the probability that you receive funding. And also speak kind of fast. Obviously, if you speak too fast, people won't understand you. So make your point clear, but speak rather fast.
Okay. And then that most of which is intuitive to me, or at least goes in line kind of with what I've heard before, other than maybe the usage of easy words, because usually I would have always in my mind, people who use a lot of eloquent wordings would be more associated kind of with, knowing what they actually do. But from what you say, this seems to be the opposite. So that is definitely good to know. And so I would imagine this is something in an investor pitch, but it is also something that is transferable to other social interactions, right? Like the way how you establish dominance is not necessarily entirely different in other social interactions. Let's say when you, talk to someone you've never met before, or in a job interview, or even when, trying to impress someone at a party or whatever. But in how far can you actually control this? Like, can you sit down, or should you sit down and say, well, I want to appear more dominant towards that person, therefore I'm going to lower my voice a little bit? Like, in how far are you in control over those factors involved and how dominant you appear?
I think you are in control of some of them, most of them even, I would say. So the voice, obviously, some people have lower voices, some people have higher voices. What I think is really important there is just go to your natural low. Don't try to go too low, but just don't try to be above, because once your voice is basically above your natural low, then there's some sign of nervousness, and you don't want to communicate that. So go to the natural low of your voice. In terms of body, yeah, you can influence it in a way that you just for example, the opposite of being really expansive with your body and of making yourself as big as possible is protecting your stomach and protecting your chest. So as soon as you go a little bit inside, with your arms and with your legs, you cross your legs, for example, you kind of point your toes towards each other, and you tend to make yourself as small as possible. And it's definitely a sign that you feel insecure. So when you realize that you're doing that, for example, then just try to expand yourself. And funnily, there's been research in the US with people where they experimented with the body language like that. So with the posture, basically, how expansive is it, how contractive is it? And they found that it doesn't not only influences basically your state of mind does your body language, but also the other way around. So basically your body language influences the way you think at a certain moment. So they analyzed, for example, they looked at the levels of testosterone and cortisol in the body, And testosterone is basically dominance hormone, while cortisol is basically a stress hormone. So they looked at the people before the study and or before that they actually expanded their body and measured the testosterone and the cortisol. And then those people had to be for 5 minutes in a really expansive posture or in a really contractive posture. And afterwards they measured it again and they found that it has a direct impact. So you can actually not only impact the way you appear, but the way you are.
So almost to a psychosomatic extent, where you would, when you sit there with your legs crossed, you would feel less dominant than when you would sit there with your chest pumped out and everything.
Absolutely.
Okay, well that's definitely something to bear in mind. Now I'm also curious. You mentioned you can partially control, like you can certainly control your gesture, right? You can control whether or not you're going to cross your legs. You can to some extent control how deep your voice is. And the moment where all of this becomes cognizant, where a person like yourself, who's pretty much an expert in the topic, knows about all of this, does this change the way you approach conversations? Like, when you talk to a person, do you approach the conversation with the goal in mind? Hey, I want to establish dominance, therefore I'm going to apply these patterns within the communication. Like, do you see a change in your behavior ever since you've read and learned about all this?
Definitely. Yeah, absolutely. I think not only during the conversation, but you can also use it before the conversation. For example, before every interview I had, before every presentation I had, and I felt nervous, I would just go to the bathroom real quick and expand myself. And just try to be as expansive as possible. And sometimes when you really feel insecure in a certain situation, you realize that expanding is kind of difficult. It's not the posture you want to have at this particular moment. But by expanding yourself, you really tend to ease your body. You tend to increase testosterone, and it's a really good thing to do. For example, before something you're nervous. And during the conversation, yeah, definitely. I try to focus on those things. So I try to read the other person's body language. Obviously, like after a while, you get used to it, so you do it subconsciously. But I try to read other person's body languages, also facial expressions, for example. But you also want to communicate in the right way, and therefore, I really, if I realize that I'm in a round, for example, with people and I don't really feel that comfortable, that I might, ease up, expand a little bit. And when I speak, I try to, not have a voice that is too high, which is mostly the case when you're nervous, then you realize, oh God, my voice is higher than it actually could be. So you go down a little bit. Also with how animated you speak. Even though I have to say that research part is really it really depends on the situation. So low animated voice and not speaking animated is not always beneficial.
Okay. Does that generally make people want to have conversations with you, knowing that you're in every moment just analyze their body language, kind of? Do they invite you to coffee more often now? Or?
Not really. I think it's rather the opposite.
Okay. All right. Well, I'll also invite you to a coffee afterwards, so that works. You're not going to be by yourself entirely, but it's interesting to think about that you can control these aspects, and as helpful as it may be for you in interview situations, like let's say you want to achieve something, get a job, be hired at a company, and then you apply all those techniques and therefore increase kind of the likelihood that you're successful. But it's also, to an extent, a fine line between using those techniques for honest intent and honest goal achievement purposes, but then, sliding into manipulation to a certain extent. Like, let's say, you take someone out for a coffee and you want to achieve something in that conversation, and how to pull certain triggers to manipulate that person into doing whatever you want them to do. So what is your thoughts on that? Like, where is the fine line between manipulation and just using it for goal achievement?
Yeah, it's a very good question, Patrick. So I think it is a delicate topic. However, it depends a little bit on how you use it, and how you do it. I think the power is not as large that you could actually manipulate a person in a really bad way, but it kind of helps you for yourself to basically communicate the best to yourself. You communicate the best side of you. You want to communicate a Patrick that is self-confident. You want to you want to be that Patrick you want to be in that particular moment. You don't want to undersell yourself. And as of the other person, it can really help. It can really help. For example, if you realize, that person is maybe not feeling comfortable with the situation, with I don't know, the area we're in, the restaurant we're at, maybe yourself, so that you actually realize, that person might not feel very comfortable, so maybe I could change something, and it can also help that person then in a certain situation to feel more comfortable, which is, I think something really good you can do in a personal aspect, but also in a work environment.
How do you interpret the signs? Let's say you notice someone has started crossing their legs, has kind of made their chest a bit more narrow. How do you interpret those signs? Like, do you know immediately what to do, or is that then just when it enters the realm of contextualization?
Well, I think a lot of it goes subconsciously. So you would see a person who would just kind of have a feeling, but obviously that also depends on the person, whether you can detect those things naturally. Otherwise, focus on those things. Focus on how the person is sitting, for example, how the person is where the person is looking at, what the person is, how the person is behaving in a certain situation, and basically from that point of view, try to figure out whether this is a good sign or a bad sign, and focus really on that. But obviously, there are like hundreds of traits that you could possibly interpret, that you could look at, and it's a very delicate topic in the way that it's not every sign does need to be true, and there's also a danger that you kind of start to interpret a certain emotions or a certain feeling, and you kind of interpret it in the wrong way. Or maybe you think the root cause is another one that it actually is. Maybe you think it's, I did something wrong, but actually the person just has a bad day. Maybe the other way around. So I think you've got to be really cautious when you start to interpret body language of other people.
And is it generally easier to interpret other people's body language that you've just met 10 minutes ago, or if someone, let's say a girlfriend who you've been with for 2 years?
Definitely the girlfriend.
Definitely the girlfriend.
Yeah, it really depends. Some people, let's say, for example, facial expressions. Some people tend to react more. Other people tend to react less. If you know the person and how responsive that person is, then you're better able to interpret those facial expressions, for example. While when you just meet a person, then you might think, like if you, let's say, for example, if you smile, if one person smiles, we're sitting now here, and I would smile, and then what would happen with yourself is basically you would realize there's a smile, and to that moment you just realize, there's something happening with his face. So in that moment you don't really know, is he crying, is he angry, or is he smiling? So what happens is it goes to your prefrontal cortex, activates a certain area, and you kind of mirror my smile. So you would smile just very slightly. It's not really, you don't really see it, but it's measurable. So they would smile a little bit as well. It would give you a positive signal, say like, that's good. So your brain would know like, that facial expression is really good. And some people have that more, some people have that less. So people who are not really very responsive, then you have to interpret the body language slightly different from people who are really responsive, who might even use those signs.
Got it. And as you do it more, as you just go out there, you sit in a cafe, you start watching people or observing people more and try to, interpret their body language. Is that really how you get certain clues, like kind of learning it by doing it, by just applying the techniques? Or is there any piece of literature or lecture that you would recommend?
There's plenty of literature, and there's also classes you can take, for example, on Udemy. In which you can, where they basically teach you what are the signs, what are the cues to look at. In terms of practicing, I think they're, like in traditional learning, there are those 4 steps where first you don't really realize it, so it's unconscious, not knowing or not no ability, and at one stage you kind of get aware that you can't do something or don't do something or don't see something. And then it's really important to go to first realize what is there, and then then you want to apply those things consciously. So you want to, for example, when you talk to a person, you want to consciously kind of focus on the body language, on the facial expression. You want to consciously focus on your own body language, on your own expressions. And after a while, it just go unconsciously. So you would realize, for example, when a person, let's say it has a very contractive body language, you would see it, detect it naturally, and you could also react naturally.
Okay, fair enough. I would imagine this adds an entirely new layer of signal reception, but also signal sending to a conversation, where all of a sudden the conversation is not just so much what you actually talk about anymore, but also the things you don't talk about, right? So, and then sometimes those things might even be the bipolar opposite, right? Someone tells you that they're comfortable with a certain situation, but their body language is indicative of the fact that they're actually not. So does that help you also to detect people who just lie to your face?
Lying is there's a whole bunch of literature about lying and lie detection. So lying is kind of another area which is really difficult, because lying often happens in the face, basically how much you sweat, so kind of in the pulse, for example. So to detect those things, you can do that, and you can get trained in lie detection, but it's more difficult. While the other part you told me about, or you just said, is that if you're talking to a person and that person says she or he is feeling comfortable, and you realize like, oh, that doesn't really fit to what the body says, then you might just get alert and just think like, okay, maybe she's not feeling that comfortable, maybe not even comfortable enough to tell you that she's not feeling, or he's not feeling comfortable.
Okay.
So yeah. So and also I think what a really good way is to kind of try to detect another person's feeling in a certain situation is that when you see a certain body language cue, try to mirror it. So basically what you have, the typical example is if you're on a date, for example, you try to, you go with your hands to the napkin at the same time, for example, and get your hands kind of touch. This is because if you're really affected to one another, and if you really like each other, then the body language tends to mirror. So you tend to have the same cues, the same way of sitting, the same way of looking, the same way of after a while, you tend to have the same signs in the face, the same wrinkles in the face, because you smile in a similar way. So, which is really interesting. So you tend to mirror each other, and if you want to know how another person feels and you can't read the body language, you can also try to mirror that body language and then see how kind of you feel in that situation. It's very difficult, and you really got to focus on that, but it should work. Yeah.
Okay, and it helps you to empathize and to kind of redirect the path the conversation is going into something better that would make you feel both kind of comfortable with the situation, and that would let you kind of work towards the best outcome of the situation.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you want to connect to a person that you just met, one way, obviously, there's all this other, you got to agree on loads of things, you got to have common interests, whatever. But one thing is just also mirror the body language, and you tend to get along better. So mirroring the body language is also something that could really help you improve relationships.
Okay, cool. Well, Theo, as always, as the conversation becomes the most interesting, we're kind of at the top of the time that we had allocated for this. Any last words you want to direct at our listeners? Any last tips you want to give them with? Now will be your time to address them.
I basically advise anyone basically in the world to just get a little bit more aware of personality traits and where you could improve yourself if you want to improve. And in terms of body language, I would definitely say it's definitely a topic that is worth reading about. And if you want to read about, do it and try to implement it very slowly, but try to implement.
All right. Well, thank you very much. If only you could have seen how broad his chest was when he just said that, you would have known that exactly that everything he talked about actually works. But Theo, it's been a pleasure having you on. Thanks for your time. I know you're very busy, so really appreciate you coming on.
Thank you, Patrick.
All right, thank you.